Hi everyone, welcome. It's just gone 11. I'm tempted to just give it 2 more minutes. Uh, is that okay with everyone? And then we can get started with the program. Koto, does that?
Yes. I think we should so get maybe a few more people on.
Cool. In the meantime, welcome, and to those who have already joined, please do let us know where you're from and who you are. We'd love to get to know you in the chat, so please do feel free to use that functionality, and then we'll get started in 2 minutes. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I think we can definitely get started. It's 5 past the hour, so we'll get moving on this. Welcome everyone to this session. We do encourage you to please use the chat function and introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're from. And thanks very much for participating in this session and for joining us. Today, for the South Feminist Futures Festival, the theme is Confronting Hegemonies. So this session forms part of that particular theme. And this session is called Funding Queerphopia and Globalising the Anti-Gender Movement. My name is Catherine Robinson. I'm a queer feminist based in Johannesburg. And I'm co-facilitating this session with my wonderful comrade and sister, Koto. Koto, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited today, and I know this is about an introduction, but I realized that in the last 10 months, today is the first day that I got up looking forward to a discussion. And I was so excited that I'm wearing a pair of sandals, like real dress sandals, you know. So it has been a very difficult year, and I am happy that we could close the year, you know, doing something that contributes to our feminist purpose. So I'm Koto Williams. I'll say Koto Reeves. Yes, I see Koto Williams on the document, but yes, my name is Koto Reeves. I'm an African feminist. I am a part of the Liberian Feminist Forum, and we've done a lot of work around movement building. Personally, I've framed my contribution to this work, the work on the continent, the work in Liberia, through the symbolism of checkpoints. And this comes from my history of being, you know, caught up in a 14-year civil war in Liberia. I believe that this morning, our conversation is going to be geared towards dismantling checkpoints and providing alternatives. So I'm excited to be a part of this, to be talking to Caroline, Vanessa, and Lydia on ways that, you know, they think that we can do this, and also to listen to the participants in terms of their contribution. So thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Koto. Pleasure to be facilitating this with you. And just to say a special thanks to South Feminist Futures for creating this space for this session, but also for this entire festival to build solidarity and share struggles to confront hegemonies and resist white cishet patriarchal supremacy. And we're here to reimagine a South feminist and queer future, and to advance a struggle for emancipation and self-determination for queer, trans, gender fluid, and non-binary folks across the globe. So thank you very much for everyone for being here, and for South Feminist Futures for giving us this space. Just a few housekeeping issues. Again, please, we'd love this to be interactive, so do use the chat. We encourage you to share your contributions. Let us know who you are and where you're from. If you would like to ask questions, we will be opening the floor for questions a bit later after our speakers have made their contributions. So please do use the Q&A function and not the chat for your questions, so we can field those questions to our speakers. This session will mostly be spoken in English. There is Spanish, Portuguese, French translation, so please find that on your Zoom tab and do listen in your preferred language. We also know that this session, it's very much focused on the African continent. We have speakers from Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa. So if there are any participants in the audience from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, outside of the African continent, we really do encourage you to make some contributions, and we can also give you a mic if you'd like to do that. So do let us know. And then finally, please do follow South Feminist Futures on social media. On Twitter, it's at South Feministas, and on Facebook, South Feminist Futures. And this festival, the hashtag is South Feminist Fest. So please do follow us on social media, and please amplify this conversation and this entire festival. So to move on, just to give you an overview and a context and purpose to this discussion, like I said earlier, this workshop falls under Confronting Hegemonies, the theme for today. And the aim is to explore the rise of the right, the globalization of the anti-gender movement, and the exportation of queer and transphobia across the global south. It has roots in colonialism, evangelical churches in the USA. It's funded by rich and conservative parties and individuals in the global north. And this movement is having profoundly negative impacts on academic freedom, gender and SOGI-SC studies, comprehensive sexuality education, LGBTQ rights, and sexual and reproductive health across the South. So, and it also has, heinous and disastrous impacts for queer, trans, and non-binary folks, hindering our access to livelihood, social and economic rights, fundamental human rights to live in freedom and dignity. And of course, as we know, it manifests in discrimination, incarceration, hate crimes, violence, and murder of trans and queer people. So we hope to explore some of the colonial foundations and drivers of the anti-gender ideology in the global South, and also discuss ways in which we build South feminist solidarity to resist and push back against this ascending hegemony of the anti-gender movement. So with that, I would love to introduce our first speaker, Vanessa Roslyn Ludwig from South Africa. Vanessa is a feminist whose thinking and actions are rooted in Africanist epistemologies, cosmologies, and ontologies. She's been an activist for many, many years during apartheid. She's a trade union organizer and educator. She's also a professional activist in various NGOs. Her main interests are women's land access and environmental justice, sexual and reproductive justice, and mobilizing women's indigenous knowledge for sustainable systemic change. And Vanessa is also a poet, writer, and illustrator. So Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us, and we welcome you. And we'd like to hear a bit more from you about the intersecting fundamentalisms driving queerphobia, driving transphobia, and some of the colonial leftovers that are giving fuel to the anti-gender ideology movement in the present. So over to you, Vanessa. Thank you. Do we have Vanessa? Is Vanessa's mic working?
Hi.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks very much. I want to start off with a poem because I'm wanting to look at specifically knowledge, and how knowledge is created, and then how in fact queerphobia is funded, but what are the driving ideologies behind it, and then how it is funded. So I'm starting with a poem from Alexis DeVoe, who says, "There was a time in which we knew these things, when we did not doubt. Ask your grandparents, or if you are among the truly fortunate, ask your great-grandparents. They know. They know about the technologies of knowledge, not these technologies, these that make of our prayers lies, not these that make us live without grace." Now, why this quote? Because it's when people make claims about other people, it's they're making claims to particular knowledge. When they say that queer people, LGBTIQ plus people, are demonic, they are abnormal, they are evil, it comes from a particular basis of how they understand the world. And so that knowledge forms the basis for them to be able to say, this is how we want the world to run. Now, we know that knowledge is not value-free. In fact, knowledge is very much implicated with power, and who has the power determines what knowledge is valued. And so when we look at what happened with Africa, and I want to start, I've been asked to speak a bit about the colonial context. We have to go back, as Amina Mama advises us to understand our present day context. We have to understand the past and understand how these institutions came to be and why we believe what we believe. So with European colonization in Africa, the European understanding of white maleness and manhood and white femaleness and womanhood was in direct contrast to the way they understood Black malehood and manhood and Black femalehood and womanhood. And this binary concept drove everything that they saw. Same thing was around race as well. So in their worldview, there was nothing other than this binary, nothing in between. And this is the binary that they then used and imposed upon Africans. They didn't come and they didn't ask, so how do you understand the world? What is your ontology? What is your cosmology? How do you see how do you know what you know? How do you decide to do things or not to do things? They just impose this. And with that imposition, through military conquest, first and foremost, and then later through controlling the minds of Africans, they were able to shift the way Africans understood the world and the way Africans interpreted the world and the way Africans therefore interacted. And why it was so important that dispossession was the key was not merely meaningful economic gain and extraction, but also because when you take someone and you displace them, when you move them away from where they are, you're taking away the very essence of knowing, the very essence of understanding themselves and their place in the world. So for example, if you lived in a particular area, your world functioned around that area. Your social organization was around the environment, that physical environment in that area. So if you lived in the mountains, this is what you did, this is how you understood it, this is how you understood the weather patterns, and so social relations were built around those things as well. In that same space, you practiced your spiritual beliefs, systems, and that brought about what we today here in South Africa in a way term social cohesion. That brought about our understanding of who we are, how we interact with the world. Once you remove people from that, because people were displaced during colonialism, that whole system gets destroyed. And now you're able to actually start controlling the minds of people. And I just want to read something from Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He says that colonialism imposed its control on the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture and how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. At the same time, so what happened was that it was very important for the mind control. And how they did this was basically in two ways. First, as I said, dispossession. And then what happened is in came the Christian missionaries. And the Christian missionaries were able to set themselves up as the protectors of African people. So we understand the European colonial project to have two key components, which was one, commerce, and the other one was Christianity. And so while military conquest was the main weapon for expanding European economic interests and subduing local populations, conversion to Christianity was vital to keeping the people compliant. And many of our local leaders converted to Christianity and allowed missionaries into the territories to erect churches and schools. And this was considered at the time a very astute political move because by having a missionary there, they were able to have an ally who could assist in negotiation with the colonial rulers. So it was their way of negotiating the choppy waters of our occupation. But this, however, proved to be a double-edged sword as more and more power over time shifted towards the missionary. But most importantly, education was placed almost exclusively in the hands of the missionaries. So the education that happens through both the physical interaction with your environment and then understanding your place theoretically was now replaced by this exclusive theoretical understanding, and from a world view that was not your own world view. Because as one of the missionaries, and further than that, what happened as well, you had to understand this worldview within a language that was not your own. So you had to also learn a new language. So as one of the missionaries said, the natives should learn to read God's word in the language of the Queen. And this was then formed the basis for a lot of the understandings of ourselves and our sexuality, particularly. Now we know that a key part of colonialism was the control of African sexuality, the control of African understandings of themselves through the control of African sexuality, through the control of African bodies. And so this then became the basis for what later would become the legal imposition of control over the African body. So firstly, what they did was they discouraged and outlawed practices of indigenous belief systems, either through theft or destruction of spiritual symbols. And they strengthened the Christian position in being a dominant belief system on the continent. Next, they introduced laws that actually would outlaw some of the practices that they found here. So if you read, for example, some of the colonial writings, you will find that many of them make reference to what they termed evil practices, which were basically what we would today probably term homosexual practices amongst people, or same-sex practices. Women loving women, men loving men, people behaving in different ways, people not necessarily having a gender binary. But because they didn't understand things in terms of gender at that time, remember, it was never part of the lexicon at that time, it was not part of vocabulary. What happened is that they understood it in terms of biological determinism. And because if you're born a male, physically, this is how you must be, this is how you must behave, this is how you must, the attitudes and the feelings towards you. And this is what actually formed the basis. And through the laws, they managed to control people even further. So for example, under colonial rule, a set of laws and policies that sought specifically to regulate African sexualities were set in place. Whether it was who you could marry, so customary laws were then replaced. How you could interact, how they controlled your family, how your family lived. So, for example, the nuclear family became more important than the extended family, and so on and so forth. Now, part of this regulation was the enactment of the so-called sodomy laws. And it happened basically across the continent, in most parts of the country. I mean, I think it was only a few places where these laws were not passed. I think it was not criminalized in Benin, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Democratic Republic of Congo, Djibouti, Equatorial Guinea, Madagascar, Mali, and Niger and Rwanda. But in every other place, it was criminalized. And almost 70% of the states was a British colonial region, who then all enacted this law, continued to criminalize homosexual conduct. Now,
just got 1 minute for wrap up, Vanessa.
Oh, no. So how was this, why was this done? It was done obviously to gain commercial interest, but more importantly, the new rise that is coming up now. What is it for? Currently, there's a pushback from people in the north claiming their rights. The system is not holding, the center is not holding. So things are starting to fall apart. People in the north are claiming their rights, they question the legitimacy of governments. In the south, things are also changing. People are more and more demanding their rights as well. Africans are saying to themselves that they want to be able to have their sovereignty and control their own destiny. And so, and people also pushing for more rights for women, for more rights for sexual minorities, as we call them. So this power and privilege that was then located within white, mainly male, cis-het men, is now crumbling. Things are falling apart. So how do you do this? What you do is you draw on the agency of people who are your allies under colonialism to reinforce a system that will make sure that people are controlled. And in your controlling of them, you're able to control the economy. I just want to give one example, and how they're doing this is through culture, through religion, and the funding of cultural and religious activities that are extremely homophobic, that are misogynistic, and that are actually all about the gospel, what we call the gospel of prosperity. I'll stop there right now, Catherine. I've really got a lot more to say, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Vanessa. I really appreciate that. And I also recognize that it's very difficult. We could go on for hours talking about the colonial underpinnings of misogyny, queerphobia, and transphobia. But thanks so much. You've also touched on, which I think is really important, the intersection of commerce and Christianity, the imposition of the nuclear family, the gender binary, compulsory heteronormativity, and compulsory matrimony, and how that was then legislated into trans and queerphobic sodomy laws, which we're still pushing back against today, which are colonial leftovers. And also how it is very much rooted in biological determinism and eugenics and scientific racism, and that those two went hand in hand. So thank you very much for that, those foundational points. I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, Lydia Namubiru from Uganda. She is the Africa editor for 50/50, which is the gender and sexuality section of Open Democracy. Lydia, thank you so much for being here. We'd like to hand over to you to tell us a little bit more about how these anti-gender movements target the systems and structures which are meant to protect and safeguard the rights of women, queer and trans people. Over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me, and let me know if I am not loud enough. I've been ill, so let me know if I need to project my voice more than is naturally happening. So yes, I am the Africa editor for specifically a team that tracks globalized and transnational networks and movements, or that focus on resisting progress on queer rights, or rolling back what progress there has been. So, and in the time I've been with the team, I think what I have sort of the main difference I've seen between the human rights movement and these movements is just how much attention one pays to the other. So the human rights movement does not pay nearly as much attention to these movements as they pay to it. And they've paid attention to the progress of human rights, to the strategies of human rights, and they've learned a lot. So a major part of how they are now succeeding to the extent to which they're succeeding or gaining influence, a major explanation for it is the extent to which they appropriate human rights language and are seeking to appropriate human rights institutions. So one way in which, I mean, it's not new at all, the appropriation of human rights language or human rights progress to roll back human rights themselves. So you know, in the US, ultra conservatives have over the years, over the decades, taken religious freedom and turned it into a weapon, weaponized it against minorities. Now, religious freedom is a very liberal idea. It can be a very liberating idea, but over the decades, it's been used to justify discrimination. If you do not, for example, one of our latest reporting on the Christian right in the US is how much the Billy Graham Evangelical Association is using religious freedom and free speech arguments in the UK to punish or to antagonize venues that would refuse to host them or because of their anti-LGBTI rights. And that is it's been effective elsewhere. It's been effective in the US. It's now being exported, the same tactic being exported to the UK, and of course also being exported to the global South, as you know, so sort of things are tested elsewhere and then moved to the global South. The second strategy is targeting the human rights organizations in the same way civil society, grassroots civil society has managed to gain some influence with them. So for instance, at the UN, civil society organizations can get observer status, and that gives them an eye into what the UN is doing, what decisions they're making, gives them an opportunity to lobby the decision makers at that level. So you are increasingly seeing ultra-conservative organizations whose values are completely the opposite of what the UN stands for, but managing to structure themselves as civil society organizations, and then and that way gaining access to the UN, gaining access to member states and representatives of member states, and lobbying them may not be officially, on the floor of the UN, but getting observer status at the UN or at the African Union gives them access to these people, and then and that way they're able to lobby them for really harmful, exclusionary decisions that maintain that colonial the colonial order that was established. So in another way is transnational networks. Again, all of these are going to be things that you're very familiar with in the way we do human rights work, trying to work with others across the world. And so they have, I get the sense that these movements have managed to, they've understood the aesthetic that works, right? Like transnational networks work, having local, instead of, because they have over many decades been criticized for being colonial. In the past few years, you're seeing more and more Africans being fronted as the voices, the faces of these movements. Very often, there's no movement in Africa on ground. They just have a token Black person speaking, calling themselves Africa Director or Africa or whatever, and that person then becomes a way to basically, what do you call it? To give this movement a Black face. This person is essentially how this movement tries to pass itself off as an Africa, as a grassroots movement, or even though it is, except for this one Black person, or except for this one or two Black person, it's a completely Western venture. So again, so in some ways they're aping what has worked to advance human rights, and in other ways, but in other ways they're really just kind of, they're appropriating it in a really cynical but nonetheless effective way. So if you look, for example, at online petitions, grassroots movements, groups that have much less power than anybody else, quickly took to the internet as a platform that can give them voice. And it's worked in some ways. It's given groups that were traditionally excluded platform, and brought their issues higher up on national agendas, international agendas. And so then you're starting to see these movements do the same. They do not have the same, they don't have the same sort of grassroots support, but the thing with the internet is you often can't tell. You can tell when a petition has been signed by 21,000 people, where those people came from. You can, you know, and again, and so it is, so they've been watching human rights movements. They've been watching what the marginalized people do to make themselves powerful, to gain some power, and they have learned to throw that back at the world and hold on to power, you know, hold on to the power they already hold, just continue to disenfranchise these groups. But ultimately, of course, as we all know, the goal is to retain the old power system, the old power structures, but outright blatant colonialism was, of course, its day is gone. And so you're starting to see these movements do what looks politically correct, which is have Black people run, find a token Black person to run your campaign, do online petitions as if you were another voiceless, disenfranchised group. Although in the end, once they've done that, very often they still fall back to the old methods, the old effective methods of the powerful, which is lobbying politicians, is sitting in closed door meetings with politicians, because very often, even though these movements are learning the value of passing themselves off as grassroots little people, they're very elite, and they have access to the corridors of power. It's not hard at all if you are. It's not hard at all if you're opposed to the rights of LGBTI people to gain access to the state house in any African, yes, in a specific African country. And then I think, maybe perhaps the last thing. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted. Right. So that's understanding what works for human rights and appropriating it to undermine human rights is a very, very big part of it. But the most influential part of it, of course, is dark money. So while human rights organizations hold themselves up to a really high standard of transparency, accountability, being open to public scrutiny, these groups are able to do whatever they want to do without necessarily revealing where their money is coming from, how much of it they have. So you never really understand what you're up against. And while at the same time, doing all of these other things to pass themselves off as little groups, even though they are transnational networked groups like the World Congress of Families. So that's, so that's about it.
Thanks so much, Lydia. That was really, really comprehensive, and I think you've really touched on the kind of critical aspects of how they co-opt and appropriate human rights language, like a lot of movements have done, or not just movements, but institutions. We see that, and we see the window dressing of using Black and African people to advance their causes. We know Israel does that. We know the IMF does that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, and just to highlight the points around how they also weaponize religious freedom to use that to justify discrimination and use that against queer and trans people. And we have our own example of that in South Africa, but luckily the Constitution has just, that particular bill, which gave people working in home affairs to reject having to marry same-sex couples. That's been overturned. But it's, we have examples of that all over the world. Yeah, and like you said, they have a lot of money. I've just seen an article, outside of the church, outside of kind of right-wing parties and politicians. I just saw a headline: a cosmetics retailer in the US called Lush has admitted to donating a lot of money to anti-trans pressure groups in the UK. So they really get their money and access those corridors of power from all angles. So thank you so much, Lydia, for sharing that with us. And that's actually a really nice segue into our next speaker, Caroline Kwasiyaman, she's a queer Pan-African feminist of Ivorian and African-American heritage. She is based in Accra, Ghana, where she works for a West African LGBTQI-led organization working to build a more just and inclusive West Africa. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. Please feel welcome. We would like for you to share with us a little bit about your thinking and thoughts around building South feminist solidarity to confront all of what Lydia and Vanessa have spoken about, and how do we confront and resist this anti-gender movement and anti-gender ideology? Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Kath, and thank you also for my fellow panelists. The benefit of going last is you get to make a lot of the connections with things that have been said before, and certainly so much that has been said has resonated. We think about examples that we've seen in the West African region of organizations like Citizen Go being set up as civil society organizations talking about human rights and dignity, and that reclaiming that language or appropriating that language, as Lydia said, being very much something that we're seeing in the region. I think there's also a way, and before I talk about solutions, because I think it's also important to look at some of the kind of the context and the ways in which global ideology campaigns and queerphobic, transphobic campaigns are manifesting themselves without even using that language. So I just want to share an example, and which is not really a well-known example, I think, within our space, and it should be. Last year in July in Burkina Faso, about 40 religious leaders from across Francophone West and Central Africa came together as part of the pro-life movement. And the framing that they use is really important for this conversation, because they didn't use gender ideology. They didn't even use imported values, but they talked about the need to protect the family and life from all of the factors that undermine it, including terrorism, including abortion, including homosexuality. So this idea, and in the context where the security questions, where the threat of terrorism is very real, the ways in which gender ideology, the ways in which these campaigns are weaponizing and using terms around undermining the family, threatening the family, infecting. I mean, we heard this a lot in Ghana last year with the World Congress of Families, of infections within school, and how comprehensive sexuality would be used to poison or to spoil our children. So there's I think while we talk about these terms, it's also important to recognize that the way they're being manifested is often not using the terms that we're using. So how do we also how do we stay mindful of the issues of language and communication? Even around the World Congress of Families conference last year, when it was announced that the World Congress of Families meeting was happening in Accra, I started talking with LGBTQI activists in the country to say, okay, do you know what's happening? How are you thinking about engaging? World Congress of Families has been quite detrimental in so many contexts. And I remember with one of the leaders of an organization said, well, you know, their sexuality education is not really around us, so we don't need to be as engaged. There's a way in which this silos that exist, these divisions that exist, are also counterproductive. And I think that also needs to be a part of our solution. One thing I want to mention in terms of ways in which we build South solidarity, ways in which we build solidarity, is actually understanding, and I think Lydia spoke to this, understanding what is the data? What do we know? What do we know about these actors? What do we know about how they're working? One thing that's become increasingly clear is that we're up against a huge, very well-resourced, very organized force, very dynamic, one that is adjusting, and our movements aren't meeting that. We're not adjusting to that. There is really important research that was produced just a few weeks ago by the Global Philanthropy Project, a report called Meet the Moment, which I'll share the link after I speak. But Meet the Moment is actually Global Philanthropy Project, which is a group of funders who all work in the LGBTQI space, is actually trying to trace the money. Where's the money go? Where's the money for these anti-gender, these gender ideology actors? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? And in this report that was just released a couple weeks ago, they found that looking at a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017, only 11 of the kind of top gender ideology organizations associated with the gender ideology movement had $6.2 billion. This is 11 organizations, primarily based in the US, had $6.2 billion. Looking at this report in a 5-year period from 2013 to 2017, GPP looked at what is the funding for LGBTI movements and what is the funding for this anti-gender ideology movement worldwide. And it was about triple. So LGBTI movements overall had about 1.2 billion US dollars, and it was about 3.7 for the anti-gender movement. Again, this is only the money that can be traced. And as Lydia mentioned, there's a lot that we don't know, a lot that's not in public records. So we need to understand what's happening. I think that is one of the key strategies. I think resources like this report is an incredibly important resource that as a community that's concerned about these issues, we need to engage with, but we also need to understand how these campaigns and ideologies are being manifested in our region. So one of the strategies I think is really key is around documentation, where we need to be documenting, we need to be doing opposition monitoring research, understanding how the campaigns are changing. I think Lydia really pointed to the point that the ways in which they're studying us, we also need to be studying them and studying really where the money flow is coming from, where it's going. I think there's a really important work around communications and narrative work that needs to happen, both in terms of reacting to some of the statements that the anti-gender campaign folks are making, but also counter narratives. So for example, how do we tell the stories of the diversity of families and the diversity of ways of being a family that have been a part of our cultures? How do we decolonize this notion of what a family is and what a family should look like? That's important work that I think as South-based feminists that we need to do, that is also around countering the impact and countering the very well-organized public relations machine that is many of these anti-gender organizations and structures. How do we engage with journalists locally and a national level and a sub-regional level? How are we proactively engaging with media to also help to shape narratives, I think is really important. How are we also building coalitions across movement? And I think especially one of the things that came very clear to me around the World Congress of Families is that the reproductive rights organizations were in one place, The LGBTI organizations were another space. They were not talking to each other, but we were facing the same structures. We're facing the same sources of oppression, but we weren't talking to each other. We weren't organizing or strategizing. And I think that these structures or organizations or movements actually feed on that. So investing in coalition building, not only in hot moments or moments when there's a World Congress of Families conference that's happening, because we also know that that's long-term work, breaking the silos. And I think from a funder perspective, ensuring that as funders, we're also investing in that kind of coalition, that cross-movement space is really incredible. I'll mention one other thing, and I know I'm close to my time. But I think there's, of course, understanding how the lessons learned, strategies that have been used across different contexts. I mean, and particularly I'm reflecting on some of the really important organizing that's happened in Latin America. How can, within the West African or broader African context, we learn about the strategies that feminist movements have undertaken in this resistance work? You know, what kind of learning can happen across? But even more so, in addition to the South-South based learning, what we're seeing is manifestations of this in parts of the global North. We look at Poland, for example, very strong backlash against LGBTI folks within the last year. There's been 100 cities labeled as LGBTQ free zones. Very, very, very strong backlash against reproductive rights. So how can we within the global South also be in solidarity with movements that may not be the global South, but are facing some of the same struggles? And how can we also learn about the ways in which they're organizing and resisting? I think I'll end there in terms of time, and there are a couple other points that I'm happy to come back to if we have time, but to also create the space for other contributions, I'd like to pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That's really great. Just to reiterate some of those points. So the research, documenting, and monitoring is critical. Building counter narratives and decolonizing colonial and imperialist and capitalist conceptualizations of the family, sexuality, and identities. And that goes right back to what Vanessa had said right at the beginning about the imposition of knowledge. And then building coalitions, so the cross-movement solidarity and the organizing and strategizing among allied movements is really important, and breaking those silos and being in solidarity with the South and the North. So thank you so much. That's a really nice full circle we've come to. Really appreciate all of the contributions. Koto, I'd like to hand over to you. Koto is going to take over the facilitation for the next Q&A session. Thanks, Koto.
Thank you to our speakers. I think it has been clear that the historical perspective ties into what is obtaining today, in terms of movement building and how there is a parallel movement that is undermining the work that is being done by feminist activists, that is being done by LGBTQ activists. And the money question that Caroline brings in, I think, is really important, because the work that has been done on the ground is first persecuted by the state, by the government, but then you also have the evangelicals in different groups that sort of, position themselves as pro-family. They are in that position, dealing with churches and different religious groups, sometimes even, members of the parliament that we have in our countries, to be able to clamp down on activists, queer activists. So it becomes very interesting when you see changes in the laws, but you also realize that in that point that was made, I think it was Vanessa who made that point about, how do you call it? Petitions, or it must have been Lydia. Yeah, but petitions and, how you get so many people being able to sign these petitions and stating, that they are for Christian values, they're for religious values. It is clearly organized to work in the same way that we are organizing. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's important to have this space, the South Feminist Future Space, to have the conversation and come up with alternatives. And there are also many other spaces where work is being done. Surely Caroline, Lydia, and Vanessa, you prove that there's ongoing work to tackle this issue. So I will now open the conversation to questions. I know we should have had questions in the Q&A box. I'm not sure whether there's any question there yet. So I don't see any questions, but I'd like to open the floor. And if you have questions and you are posting in the chat, I will follow that now, and I will invite, I see that, we're heavily represented by Africa in terms of the speakers. So I'm going to ask if we have participants who are from South and Southeastern Asia, the Middle East. If you have specific questions, please, we'll give you the opportunity to speak first. So the floor is open for that. But in the meantime, I would say, Caroline, Vanessa, and Lydia, how would you frame what you have discussed, so far in terms of the funding, the language, the persecution, and also the history and how that history has impacted queer people and queer people's rights? How would you frame that within this challenging time of not only, a pandemic, but also a political crisis that we have globally with our countries and elections of outright leaders? So maybe you could start to speak to that as we wait for the questions from the floor. Lydia, you can go first. I can see you gearing up.
Right. I do think politically, this is actually a really good time for these movements because of the rise of populism and because they go after rights that, the absence of which affects only a minority of the population. It's good fodder for populist politicians to pick on. It's, again, the way democracy works is the majority, especially, the sort of democracy in its most basic form, going to the polls, is if you can appeal to the majority, you win an election, regardless of whatever your other flaws might be. And giving the majority a small minority to see as the full extent of their problem. If you tell the majority in Uganda, for instance, who have been under the same leader for 35 years, who are saying increasing human rights violations by the state and so on, you could very easily distract them by telling them, but the real issue is that, the real issue is homosexuals or transgender, non-conforming people, which is like, it seems very, very simplistic, but I think we are all of us are often very, very simplistic in our approach to elective politics. And so you kind of, like, very many people, myself included, don't really understand what the people we vote for are about. I just need one thing, one issue on which to vote. And these issues, sexuality issues are very, very easy one issue, they're very, very easy to sell to single issue voters. And they're very, very easy to get allyship on from populist, but otherwise non-democratic leaders who nonetheless need to win elections. So this, this resounding comeback of populism is really good for these anti-gender anti-minority groups to.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. We still don't have questions. Again, I'll call for questions, comments, especially for participants from Latin America, South and Southeastern Asia. If you have questions or you have comments, you have not put them in the Q&A box, you can put them in the chat and we'll read them out. We'll go on to Caroline, then Vanessa for feedback on that question. In the midst of political and a political crisis and a pandemic, how does this conversation fit? How do you see it fitting?
Thank you, Porto, for the question. I mean, I would echo much of what Lydia has also said. I think, you know, and the, you know, the other point that I wanted to speak to is particularly, you know, in the context of this global public health crisis, what that has meant for the erosion, the further erosion of civic space, you know, in this year since March, across, and I could speak I can speak most closely to the context of West Africa, where we've seen new laws introduced around surveillance, or the justification of the COVID crisis for further surveillance, restricting of organizing, restricting of assembly, where we've seen also attempts at law projects, such as the attempt at a new infectious disease bill in Nigeria that would have really wide sweeping consequences, including giving very strong powers to the government to close any buildings, close any spaces deemed to be at public health risk. I mean, and also eroding existing protections around privacy of information. I mean, those are just some of the examples, but in several countries, we saw new laws around surveillance, around permission of governments to track people with the rationale of contact tracing. And we know in a number of countries how these different laws and policy instruments have actually been used to target communities that are minority communities that are seen to be in opposition to the state, in opposition to the status quo. So there's a lot that's happening in this moment that has been rationalized under the guise of Corona, under the guise of public health, of public safety. That's very worrying. And I think, you know, so it's a little bit of a different context than, you know, than when we were speaking about already, but I see this conversation fitting in to the fact where there's more and more restrictions around organizing, there's more and more restrictions around assembly, there's more and more restrictions around individual, you know, around civil liberties that we're seeing in the countries in which we work. And that's a very worrying theme. That's a very worrying theme, and it's a very worrying trend. So that's an additional element that I wanted to reflect on.
Yeah, thanks for that contribution, Caroline. I'd like to, you know, reinforce that because I remember during the Ebola crisis in West Africa, we had a similar response from not only the church, but also from the state, where people who worked in public health and also you know, senior church leaders got together and they decided that they knew where the Ebola crisis was coming from. It was from people who had done things that were against the will of God.
Exactly.
And it was almost like, you know, the sort of Sodom and Gomorrah story.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that again has happened with the COVID pandemic. So I'll go on to Vanessa. Vanessa, how do you think this conversation fits within the political crisis that we have? For example, in South Africa, what are the issues around funding, the funding queerphobia and the anti-gender movement?
Well, I think that look, the funding of the anti-gender movement, I mean, it's always been there. I don't think it's ever gone away. It's just about balance of power. But there is a new discussion, a contestation around notion of citizenship and who are citizens. And the most privileged citizens, or the hierarchy of citizenship, obviously based within this whole thing of biological construction. This is a man, this is a woman. The people that are more likely to get, particularly now when we're talking about COVID-19 and the vaccine, who's going to get the vaccine first? It's not going to be your LGBTIQ people, particularly those who are most marginalized living within townships. But the other thing I want to talk about, when you have these kinds of crises, you're also having massive economic crisis. And when you have a massive economic crisis, when there is an massive increase in poverty, massive increase in people living without dignity, like you said, the easy thing of the scapegoat. And it's because of these people, the problematic women, first and foremost, those who want to go and have abortions, those who don't want to have children, those who don't want to get married, and then, of course, all these other people that are doing even abominable things in the sight of God. So this is our punishment. But the economic crisis, in an economic crisis, the most marginalized are the ones who also suffer the most. Now for me, I've come to realize that we're never going to have as much funding as the dominant powers, because they are trying to retain a system of extraction from Africa. And so they're going to pour in all this money into evangelical churches, which are popping up all over the place. And the poor are running to it in the hope of salvation, that God will somehow bless me for being true and keeping my children true, because poverty levels are extremely high. So this is and obviously within COVID-19, it's gotten worse. Our unemployment rate at the moment is something in the region of 40-odd%. And so there's and when there's a crisis of finance, it's crisis of the economy, people turn to faith to try and pull them through. And I think this is what's happening, and it's deeply concerning about this. But I also want to just one thing about us getting involved with our communities around the broader struggles, us being involved in the struggles of communities around land issues, around accessing proper education, not just as queer people, but in the broader community issues, because we come from those communities. And once you work with people and people start seeing you as human, because there is that contestation around citizenship and what is human, that can also start shifting things slightly. So we have to tackle them on the ideological level as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We still don't have questions. So Kath, I'm going to move to the next session that looks at closing remarks and reflections.
Sorry, Corto, can I just, something that Vanessa said just really resonated in me, and I also just wanted to add another reflection. Can I speak to that?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, Vanessa, I mean, everything that you just said really resonated with me. And, one thing we've been doing a lot of thinking about, in my organization is how, how do we also tell that story? Because we know that queer people and trans people have been involved as citizens in social justice movements that were not just about LGBTI rights, but often those stories are erased or not told. And so that's something that we've been doing a lot of thinking about. The most recent example of the movement against police brutality in Nigeria, the anti-SARS the anti-SARS citizen organizing, the ways in which queer people have been leaders, not just now, but for years, because of the ways in which we have often been the target on the target of violence, of police brutality. So I think that's really interesting. But the point that I don't know if it's a point, but I'm also just reflecting about the role of structural adjustment programs. I'm thinking about the role of structural adjustment programs, that took place throughout the continent, and how the responsibility of the state to provide certain social services around education, around health, became, and this, as we talk about hegemony, coming from economic, economic hegemony, took away that responsibility and resources from the state, and how that also created a space for religiously affiliated churches, schools, religious centers to step in and then become the educators, then become the schools, the places people go to for respite, the places people go to for health. And so I'm just thinking also, as we're talking about the legacy of colonialism, what is the legacy also of programs like structural adjustment programs in creating the kind of context that we are now? And so it's something that sparked when you were talking, when you were making your comments. And I'm also thinking about that thread and how that has also contributed to our context now.
Yes, thanks for making that point, Caroline. I know yesterday, Vanessa, you were interested in talking about the structural investment adjustment programs and how they played a role in reinforcing fundamentalisms in our society. So yeah, so I guess you and Caroline, you're in sync, even though you have not.
Even though we were in the same conversation.
Yes, definitely. But yes, it's really about the state retreat and the, sort of role. It's almost like a legitimate role, and I'll say legitimate, with quotes, because if the state cannot provide public services and you have a particular group that steps in, it makes it difficult to challenge that group, because where are you going to do the challenge? It's within state institutions, whether it's the courts, in different groups, like institutions. Most people across the continent, across the African continent, went to Catholic schools. So it makes it very difficult when you are, doing advocacy around abortion. You see that everyone will be like, I don't want my pastor to get angry, because I'm doing this. It's really about that indoctrination that happens, earlier on, because the state had retreated. So I think this is really, a good way to connect in terms of the way the three of you are thinking. I want to move on now because I realize that we have a comment from Stephanie. So Stephanie is saying, thank you, Caroline, for particularly articulating the issue of structural adjustment programs that have reinforced religious fundamentalism in our countries. Thanks, Stephanie, for that feedback. Is there any other person? I'm going to open it up because I think it has become, very, not just interesting, but this is something that we feel directly and we've been a part of in terms of its impact on our lives. Is there anyone who would like to provide any feedback before I move back to the panelists for the sort of closing reflections?
Sorry, Koto, I was just thinking we had a comment from a comrade in India. I've asked Letu to make this person a speaker. I don't know if that's possible. I think we're just...
She's here now.
Okay.
Please, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, great. Could you please go ahead?
It's Ditileka Sharma from India. Would you like to, we've given you the mic if you'd like to share a contribution.
I think you're on mute, DT. Could you please?
Sorry, I made an assumption. She's actually not in a position to speak. Apologies.
Okay.
I'll just read out the question, but also the contribution. Apologies for that. In India, we are witnessing a lot of right-wing LGBTQ people are getting funding, political positions and power from the state, as well as corporates. And these folks are being used to surveil other queer persons who are dissenting against right-wing regimes. So a bit around the corporate co-optation of the queer, of queer rights. I think that goes back to what Lydia was saying about that.
Right.
That co-optation and appropriation of left-wing progressive LGBTQ work. Can anyone amongst our panelists reflect on how that's also happening in other regions? Thanks for that contribution.
And there's also a second question that comes from Stephanie. I did not look at the Q&A box, but there's a second question that says, given that these conservative organizations are pushing conservative and queerphobic ideology through reliance on religion and traditional family values, where do you see avenue for countering this messaging? How can we incorporate political education into our movements when the church and its prescriptions on morality is still foundational for many Africans? So back to the conversation we're having. So perhaps we could take, one person could take the first question and then another person take the second one. Who wants to go? Lydia, Caroline, Vanessa?
Yeah, I don't have fully formed thoughts on sort of using LGBTI people to fight, to fight progress for many, except to say that it is not new. It's so an age-old tactic. This is how colonialism itself worked. And very often, at least in my country, in Uganda, the handmaidens of colonialism were Black people who were privileged or given access to certain privileges, wealth, and land, and all of that. So it's a thing that movements always have to contend with, which is that just being a member of a minority group does not necessarily make you progressive, doesn't necessarily make you aware of the ways, doesn't make you a community conscious person, and that very many people, often people with a minority identity, very often decide to align themselves with power because of what's in it for them, very in the short run, and I don't know that there's a fix for it. There isn't, except to be aware of it and to not be derailed by sort of the coming across people who have made that choice to personal gain over community well-being. It's as old as time, I feel like.
Thank you, Lydia. For the next person who's gonna answer, could you please speak for 2 minutes? We're almost at the end. Sorry for doing time in that way, but who wants to go? And that's around, how do we counter the messaging? How do we incorporate political education into our movements when the church and its prescriptions on morality is still foundational for many Africans? Who wants to go? Caroline, Vanessa?
Yes, Coach, so I'll speak a little bit about that, because I think it's important that we do that. That we first the important thing is that we uncover hidden knowledges. I think those things are important, that we need to start saying, but these are not necessarily, were not necessarily our pre-colonial traditions. These things came in, were imposed, and then were used to uphold the elites, as Lydia was saying, that are running the country and running the world. So we need to really spend some time around unearthing African ways of understanding and seeing things. And I think there are spiritual movements, African indigenous spiritual movements in South Africa at least, that are trying to come up with an alternative narrative The other thing is that, of course, yes, the churches, religious institutions are very much at the forefront of them, but not of this pushback of rights, but not all are. And we need to work with those who are not necessarily fighting against the rights of women, but are actually supportive of women's rights. They are supportive of some of the feminist ideals, and that they are supportive of LGBTIQ rights. And we have to work with them. I think Caroline mentioned of working with our networks. And I just want to also add, because I loved what Caroline had said earlier, I just want to say, yes, Caroline, you're right. They plan our oppression. So how are we planning our liberation? When at the world, at all the Bretton Woods institutions, they plan the next 25 years of economic oppression. How are we planning the next 25 years of our liberation? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll do 1 minute each, closing reflections, anything that you did not, say. So we'll go around and do 1 minute, and then we'll go to Kath for the closing. So Caroline, we start with you.
Yeah, I actually don't want to say anything after after Vanessa's statement. I feel like that really captures it. I mean, I think we need to continue to engage in these kinds of conversations online, but offline, we need to see how we make this political education. I absolutely agree, but how do we make it accessible? How do we make it available in local languages? How do we simplify so much of the terminology and the conversations that we're having, so that a wider range of communities can be involved in it and can be involved in this struggle? And so I come back to the communication. I come back to the importance of reframing what makes a family, who is a family, what does a family look like, and drawing from all of the experiences, the lived experiences and historical experiences that we have in our various communities.
Thanks, Caroline. Lydia?
Two things.
Yes.
Sorry, yeah. Two things. One is to bring back, say something about Caroline's point on the legacy of structure adjustment and state retreat, and to say that the retreat of the state from our lives, the diminishing of public life, is a very big goal for these movements that are anti-gender. So beyond fighting LGBTI rights, beyond fighting women's rights, women's access to abortion, you see them pushing for things like, non-standardized, pushing against, for example, public education, for, pushing for homeschooling. And so that, I think, and that may be a way to bring elected politicians into allyship with us, is to demonstrate the extent and the various ways in which these movements seek to diminish public life, and therefore diminish the sphere in which we all have a shared reality and a shared understanding of who is valuable and who deserves protection, and that. And then onto how do we message around the church. I think it's important to continually point out the ways in which the church is power, the church is an economic system. I think while morality arguments may not fly as well, I do think lots of Africans are oppressed. Lots of people in the South are oppressed in terms of economics and power relations, and they can understand that they can come to separate their interests from the church's interest in that way.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Vanessa, is that your
yes
last
so I want to agree with Lydia. Absolutely, economic liberation is at the core of us being able to assert our sovereignty and determine our own destiny in terms of how we define ourselves, who we are, and where we want to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Over to you, Kath. Thank you so much for your feedback and your reflections.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Koto, and thank you to all the panelists. That was amazing. I'm so glad that the intersections of the neoliberal order and patriarchy has come out so clearly in this session. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's been such a great discussion, and just to reiterate the importance of, as Vanessa, as all of you have pointed out, that the church is an economic institution. The rollback of the state and the privatization of public life is really fundamental to the ascendance of this hegemony, the anti-gender movement. So fighting for our economic liberation and doing that through countering narratives and political education will be critical to resisting. So thank you so much. That was incredible. I would like to just plug the next session. If participants are interested in this topic, we do plan to delve into this a little bit more on Thursday the 10th as part of this South Feminist Futures Festival. It's under the theme Building a New Knowledge Base for South Feminist Activism, Queer Visions for South Feminist Solidarity and Internationalism. And I'll be facilitating that together with Pumi Mtetwa. So if you're interested, do join us. That's at 4 o'clock GMT or 6 o'clock Southern African time on Thursday the 10th. I would just like to thank the speakers so much for your contributions. We've learned so much, and this was a really important discussion. Thank you so much to South Feminist Futures for hosting this discussion and this festival, and to all the founding members who put so much work into this. And we are grateful to the funders for supporting this critical space. And obviously to all the participants for being here. We really appreciate your contributions and being audience members in this important discussion. So thank you so much. I'd like to just give Koto the last words, if you wish, to come in, and then we'll say cheers.
Yeah, I think the important thing is we're doing this at the end of a very important year. You know, it's the pandemic. We have had a huge challenge as the feminist movement. For those of you who work on a daily basis, Lydia, Vanessa, Caroline, challenging the hegemonies that exist in our personal and professional life, you understand that it has exponentially increased. This impact has exponentially increased during this year. I want to say that the good news is that this is not the end of the South Feminist Futures. So this is the beginning of our work, and we will continue. So in terms of engagement, I know, Caroline, you're doing a lot, writing there, providing resources, but also, this is the beginning of establishing linkages. So we'll definitely, reach out in the new year. Hopefully, we're looking forward and looking up during that time. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who, you took your time to join us, provide feedback. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers, the funders, and we have work to do. So next year, we start after the break. So this is the beginning. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Thanks, Koto. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Vanessa. I really appreciate it.